All right, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. As many of you probably just saw, this event is being recorded, just so everyone is aware. And we would ask, like I said, that unless you are a speaker or asking a question, that you do mute yourself throughout the program. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Heidi Droshak. I'm the executive director at VA Our Way. We are a nonpartisan organization interested in government transparency, bipartisanship, and citizen engagement in state and local politics, especially here in Virginia. So for all of you joining us, why are we here tonight? We just wrapped up the 2022 General Assembly session, although we don't have a budget. And tonight we are hoping to walk through the outcomes of that session, specifically around certain issues and the plans for those issues in the years to come. So just to set the stage for everyone, we had 2,250 bills introduced in the legislative session, which is pretty typical. That is excluding commending and memorializing resolutions. That's somewhere around 3,500. And of those 2,200 bills, 892 passed. We are not going to walk through all 892 bills tonight, but we will dive into some of the biggest good governance topics. Specifically, we're going to focus on campaign finance reform, ranked choice voting, and potentially a little bit of a backwards look into redistricting with the help of our panelists. So tonight you're going to hear from three panelists who will each talk for about 10 minutes about their respective topics. And then we will open up for, sorry, got dogs in the background. We will open up for about 20 minutes of question and answer towards the end before we wrap up with summaries. So some of you may already be familiar with our panelists, but I'm going to briefly introduce all of them. First, we are going to hear from Nancy Morgan. Nancy is the coordinator of the Virginia chapter of American Promise, a nonpartisan group working on campaign finance reform to pass both an amendment on the federal level to the U.S. Constitution, as well as campaign finance reform legislation here in Virginia. Before working at American Promise, Nancy was an economist who worked overseas for the United Nations for 18 years. And tonight she will be talking to us about campaign finance reform. Next, we will hear from Elizabeth Melson, who is the president and a founding board member of Fair Vote Virginia, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit champion of ranked choice voting. Elizabeth has been working with local representatives to introduce ranked choice voting in the Virginia General Assembly since 2016, and correspondingly, she is here to talk about ranked choice voting with us tonight. Finally, we will be hearing from Brian Cannon, who is a longtime democracy reformer that many of you may be familiar with. He has over a decade of nonprofit leadership, community building, and advocacy on state policy issues. He has worked as the campaigns director at the Institute for Political Innovation. He led Virginia's bipartisan redistricting reform at One Virginia 2021. And tonight he'll be here to give us a national look at some of these good governance issues as the director of advocacy for Fair Vote. So before I hand it over to Nancy, I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions as the panelists go, please write them in the chat. I will collect them as we go, and then we will, like I said, open up for about a 20-minute question and answer after the panelists. So please feel free to drop them in as we go, but do know I won't address them probably towards the end. So with that, I will hand it over to Nancy, and we will look forward to an update on campaign finance reform.
Thank you so much, Heidi, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. As Heidi mentioned, I'm the coordinator of the Virginia chapter of American Promise. What is American Promise? It's sort of unique in a democracy space in that it specifically focuses on a constitutional amendment to overturn 40 years of Supreme Court rulings that basically have given corporations and special interests more power and taking it away from the voice of the citizens. When we started 4 years ago, we realized that we would be remiss if we didn't look at Virginia's campaign finance system, because obviously it's clear we have some of the laxest campaign finance laws in the country. So we looked at that, and why should we care about money in politics? Well, because we the people, not money super PACs or corporations govern. And I think everybody out there among you will find yourself in this space if you care about climate change, you know, clean energy, dominion, healthcare, spiraling across of prescription drugs, I think that we all recognize that basically there's been a policy capture over the last 40 years where our public policies don't represent the will of the people. And a lot of that is linked to money in politics. So when you look at money, you have to just say, oh my goodness, when you look at 2020, it was a blowout record in terms of money in politics. This was obviously the presidential year. It was also congressional races where you had 2 Senate races in Georgia that we were watching, South Carolina, North Carolina, or Arizona. It was like a $500 million races each of these. Even poor Maine, they had $200 million come into Maine. And a lot of that was from the dark money space. If you look at this 2010, that heralded, that marked the Citizens United ruling, which basically opened the door to a flood of undocumented independent expenditures from corporations, which were banned by Teddy Roosevelt in 2007 in terms of campaign funding. So it opens a door to all this money coming in. It could be dark money in the 501c4 space, or super PACs would actually have to report to the Federal Elections Commission, but you really don't get that until after the election. Of course, Virginia is a little bit different, but when you look at the trend, it's the same. You have this escalating growth in the cost of elections. We're one of only 5 states that has no limitations on campaign finance. We are one of 2 states that has no restrictions on personal use of campaign finance. So when you looked at 2021, just look at that elections, the cost of the House race was 80 million. But then the governor's race, it was like 66 million in 2017. And I was going, I'll bet $10 that it's going to be over 80 million. And it turned out to be 140 million. And a lot of it was to do, Youngkin is basically self-financed, which under Buckley versus Palaio, the Supreme Court ruling in 1976 allows him to do that. And what does this mean? It means Virginia rates 46 on the Swamp Index, which is a coalition for integrity rating of states based on ethics and campaign finance. You can see Virginia, we're only surpassed by Utah, Michigan, Arizona, Idaho, and Wyoming. So when just looking at campaign finance, we've been looking back, like for 30 years, Governor Wilder had a report that he recommended in 1994 to put in campaign finance limits. So that's 30 years ago. And since then, it's been sort of a graveyard of campaign finance bills. Just last year, there were 10 bills introduced. The only bill that passed was a proposal to set up a joint legislative study committee on campaign finance. So actually, we were very active, and I see my colleague Jessica Mott here. We were testifying. We developed these documents, citizen study report on the need for campaign finance. We discussed with jurisdiction experts from jurisdictions around the states, whether it's Minnesota or Washington State, what are best practices? So we thought, okay, we're coming into 2020, most expensive election in Virginia history, 7 million obscure attack ads. This joint study committee met, press coverage. We did some polling by the Wasson Center of Christopher Newport University, which was very positive. 78, almost 80% support campaign finance, 88% want disclosure, 73% say you should have restrictions on personal use. It was like, yes, this is great. And so at the beginning of the session, it was like, okay, we've got 24 bills that were introduced. I was like, oh my God, it's raining campaign finance. This is going to be a real year. This is a year for good governance. Well, maybe not so much, We're Heidi and I and Jessica were all laughing. It's like, okay, our batting average, not so good. There are only 3 still in play. Actually, there is four, which is stuck in the budget debacle between the House and the Senate. But when you look at the types of bills, we have oversight, which basically the Department of Elections is the entity that oversees campaign finance. They have no regulatory authority. They can't issue subpoenas. They can't do investigations. So when we did the analysis, we said, okay, the foundation for comprehensive campaign finance is oversight. So there was one bill and actually there's one bill David Bulova introduced in it and it passed. Disclosure, not so good. 10 bills were introduced. and only 2 passed. One of is still in limbo because of the budget. Limitations is the sexy area of campaign finance. Everybody, when they think of campaign finance, we want limits. And the limits were capping limitations, banning contributions from public utilities like Dominion. And there's also the personal use, which is sort of limitations, sort of ethics, but it was pretty amazing. 12 introduced and 0 passed. And then there's an extension of the study committee, which is like, many of us are like, is this kicking the can down the road? Well, it gives us a voice at least. But I just want to mention a key bill that died, which was restricted personal use of campaign contributions. You guys probably are aware of this bill. It's been around for 6 years. You know, it was introduced in last year and it got through the General Assembly, the House of Delegates, 100-0. It's like, wow, that never happens. Goes over to the Senate. It dies of 1,000 cuts. It's redrafted in a taxpayer-funded, bicameral, bipartisan committee, presented and by a Republican and a Democrat, Marcus Simon, and it died in the House in a Republican subcommittee. And then there was a Senate bill, John Bell, which was really reworked. And so they brought it over, and that was again killed in subcommittee by 5-3. You know, which I think was, everybody was like, this is seriously the lowest common denominator. This was the bill that should have been passed. Anyway, so what we're still optimistic. Obviously, we got a 5-year plan. This is not, things don't change overnight. And I'm sure Brian and Elizabeth can tell you the same thing. Right now, we're doing money out pledges, getting people to say, commit to good governance and getting money out of politics. We do legislative outreach. Now we're doing a campaign letter to the editor, making people aware, you know, that out of 24 bills died in the General Assembly. Partnerships like with Heidi, working with community to pass local resolutions. And above all, I think what we really focus is on building advocacy skills of Virginians and having them raise their voice. So anyway, that's my story, and certainly I'm glad that you joined us, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our other speakers just on how to do effective advocacy in order to get bills passed. Thanks, Heidi.
Thanks, Nancy. And now we will pass it over to Elizabeth.
Okay, yeah, Elizabeth from Fair Vote, Virginia. We do advocate for ranked choice voting, and if you're on this call and you're not familiar with that, it's basically a small change to the way we vote. Instead of voting for one person, you rank your candidate in your order of preference. And ranked choice voting requires a majority result. So the candidate with the fewest number of votes is removed, and it goes through an instant runoff process until a consensus winner rises to the top. And you can read more about that on our website, fairvotevirginia.org. We have some videos that explain the process with little post-it notes. But we had 2 bills in this past General Assembly. One was just expanding a law that allows localities now to implement ranked choice voting. It was just expanding that to more local offices like treasurer, constitutional offices. So it really wasn't a major, change. It was just expanding a law that we already have. And the other one was a bill that would have allowed parties the option to choose to use ranked choice voting in primaries. What happened is both these bills were quickly put on privileges and elections committee agenda on a Friday morning. They didn't go through subcommittee, they went straight to full committee. The bills actually had a lot of favorable comment, both of them, even from the election commissioner, advocacy groups, people that used ranked choice voting in the Republican convention that nominated, the governor we have now and lieutenant governor and attorney general. And despite that, the bills were voted to be laid on the table. So which is not good. It means they don't move forward. So what we did is we just ran a campaign after that said we were asking for a motion to reconsider. It was a long shot, but it died so quickly. We were like, we're not done. We're not done fighting. So we asked our followers to, talk to these privileges and elections committee members and ask them to bring this back up. What are some of my prompting questions? What else do you want to know?
Well, I think, Elizabeth, it might be great to kind of talk a little bit about where you see the future of this issue and where you see it over the next 5 years might be helpful for everyone.
Yeah, so it's been really interesting to see how it works each year and the different dynamics of which party is the majority. Are they the majority of each, Senate and House, or is it divided? And this year it was divided. And I think that's kind of a readjustment period for our General Assembly because, there obviously we can't avoid partisan, I don't want to say games, but the way that things move through and how they strategize and what bills are priority. So those things do happen, and sometimes things come from the leadership on certain bills. They decide to take a certain position based on other things that are going on, especially in elections. They're still looking at election integrity and making sure that our elections are secure. There's still some that believe that election was stolen in 2020. So I think that the Republican Party was not eager to make any changes to elections before they could ensure with all their party members and leadership members that elections are working as they should be in Virginia, despite the information that the election department at the state level has already directed localities on how to run ranked choice voting, and that the processes are in place that that will allow for localities to choose to use ranked choice voting. And right now that's limited to county boards and town councils. So I think what we need to do is really make sure that we have some localities, if they're looking at ranked choice voting, that we get it implemented well over the next year. And so that when we're back at the General Assembly, we can say we have all these localities that have implemented and they do want to expand it to school boards or treasurer, but the laws don't currently allow that. And what that takes organizing our grassroots around the cities that are already looking at it, to make sure that it's not just like a grass tops initiative, that their constituents actually want it, collaborating with other reform organizations so that we're multiplying our impact, and then also working that legislator, the grass tops, when all year long, so that we're talking to the Privileges and Elections Committee members, we're talking to the leadership of both parties and educating them if there's any gaps in education, and working with conservative leaning organizations that advocate for ranked choice voting, or also known as instant runoff, so that we make that lift lighter and we have more people doing that work, so that we get different results next year.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And then another question, I see Jack and Brian have been answering questions in the chat, but I think it might be helpful to talk about ranked choice voting is obviously a pretty, in some ways, a little bit of a complicated issue, or I think a misunderstood one in a lot of eyes of the voters. And so I'm curious how much of your efforts are focused on voter education and teaching people about this issue and how it works, and how much legislator education you have to do. Is this still, an issue that's misunderstood by legislators?
So looking back at, I have been going to the General Assembly since 2017, well, I guess 2018, and talking to some of the same electeds over and over again. And what I have found is that some of those that elected you know, in 2019, when I talk about this issue, they were really in the information stage. Like, what is it? What do you mean? And now they're very much more familiar with it, especially on the Republican side, because they were using it in their convention. So now they're like, yeah, I like ranked choice voting, but they have their own reasons for why they didn't move the bills forward this year. On the education of the voter side, you know, all of our social media is targeted towards education, you know, our website. But what we find when we do in-person events or, you know, Zoom events is once you explain it, once they try it, it makes sense. And they're like, oh, yeah, this makes sense. So I think people that are elected that use that excuse that the voters don't understand it, it's just a convenient way out. Because we do rank things every day in life. We know how to rank things. You go to a restaurant and they don't have the dessert you want. So what's your second choice? Or any business decision or life decision, you rank your options. So I don't know that that's valid, really.
Okay, and one of the issues that's being discussed in the chat, which I'll raise, is can you speak a little bit to the difference between preference voting and ranked choice voting?
I'm not sure about, is that another alternative voting? You know, there's several different alternative voting ideas that advocates, you know, are talking about across the nation. I've heard of approval and star and things like that. I don't know if preferential is one of those two, or if it's another name for ranked choice. I haven't heard it called ranked choice called preferential before. Maybe Brian can help me out with that.
Okay, yeah, we can happily bring that up again in the question and answer portion. Perfect. Well, is there anything else you'd like to share before we turn it over to Brian?
If you're interested in helping out in your area, go to our website and click the join button so that we can get you connected with other people.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And now we will turn it over to Brian to get a little bit of a national view on some of these issues.
Hey, y'all. So nice to be with reformers in Virginia again. I feel like I speak to a lot of reformers around the country now from this same spot. But I don't get to talk to a lot of Virginians. So this is a treat for me. As most of you probably know, I spent the better part of the last decade working on getting fair districts in Virginia, and we did. We have some of the best maps in the country. Now, sometimes that's a low bar, but there's some pretty good ones out there, and we're among them, which is a hell of a change for the Commonwealth. So I'm really proud of that. I think the story, for those of you who followed the commission, was bipartisan. I didn't necessarily think it was going to fall apart because I thought there would be the right incentives, but knowing that we had the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court as a backstop was a big play for us. It was better than sending it back to the legislature by a mile. And I had a lot of faith in our state Supreme Court, and they came through. But I think that is also something that's coming through in other parts of the country. You're seeing state Supreme Courts like Ohio right now is doing, the Lord's work on beating back what's a really poorly structured kind of commission approach, and it was all they could get, so it's better than nothing. But the Ohio Supreme Court's really been holding them to the fire on it, as well as like the Wisconsin Supreme Court, even though they may have gotten slightly overruled today by the U.S. Supreme Court. But I think that the story of this decade is there is a lot of there are a lot better maps because of the reforms last decade, and a lot of those maps are attributable to state Supreme Court stepping in and doing the right thing, even though some of them are, elected in kind of partisan-ish ways. So what I'm going to do in this, I don't have enough time to like tell you everything I've been up to and all that we're doing. So I'm going to sprinkle in a couple of different things and go real shallow on them, and then hopefully we can get to them in a Q&A, because I think I'm what's standing between us and Q&A, and that's always my favorite part of these kind of things. So I'm very pleased with Virginia's success in the state Supreme Courts. The other thing I have listed on here is where we're pushing ranked choice voting, and we talked some of this in the chat. I think one of the best tools in the near term, and there's a couple tools out there, but one of the best things to do is get ranked choice voting in presidential primaries. And let me tell you why I think that's helpful. First and foremost, it is a partisan primary, So if you talk to Maine Republicans, they hate ranked choice voting because one time one of their candidates who ran a poor campaign lost in a ranked choice voting ballot. He would have won a plurality, but then they counted up he didn't win a majority, so they counted the second place votes and he lost. And that's like a thorn in their side. Now there's examples of that on every party, but that's the Maine Republicans example. So if you move it to a presidential primary or any primary, you remove the fear of the other guy's going to win. So now it's just like in the Republican primary in Virginia, they used ranked choice voting. They were only going to get a Republican. A Democrat wasn't going to magically win the Republican primary there, right? So it's a little bit. It takes the temperature down on the change for partisans that have to approve it. It's also a much better way to do it. For example, Washington State votes on votes a week after Super Tuesday, and the Washington State has a lot of. Oh, Nancy, there's no difference between RCV and instant runoff voting. It's the same thing. That instant runoff voting polls slightly better with Republicans in some places. But Washington State has a lot of really good early vote by mail laws, all the kind of things you'd want. And by the time they got around to counting their presidential primary ballots in 2020, a quarter of the voters, 25% of the voters, had cast a vote for somebody who's already out of the race, right? Easy fix to do ranked choice voting there, right? Washington State should easily adopt ranked choice voting. Let those people have their second and third preferences as it needs to be. It's optional. We had resistance from the Democratic State Party there in Washington State, so we've got some more work to do this offseason. But that's a really easy win. And then the third reason why I think that's helpful is because on an election administration side of things, and a lot of you all know that like election administrators sometimes come up and say less than nice things about ranked choice voting. It is as easy as 1, 2, 3 for voters, but it's not as easy as 1, 2, 3 for them. And Lord knows they've had a tough couple of years beyond. I'm really trying hard to like come around on seeing them as like an obstacle and more like we need to be their ally. But the good news about presidential primary ranked choice voting for the election administration side is it's just one issue or just one question. So it's not like a ballot with Senate, Congress, mayor, blah blah blah. Like it's just one race, and that's easier to administer. So it's a great way for them to kind of get their feet wet on ranked choice voting and prove that you can do it at a statewide level, so at scale. So I think that presidential primaries is a really viable option. I would look for Utah and Virginia in kind of the reddish state category. I'd look for Vermont and Washington State and Colorado. Otherwise in that, and I and some other states will use it. Five Democratic states used it in 2020 for the presidential primary. That had like a little more to do with the pandemic than not. But in one Republican, Indiana used it there. There are also some anti-RCV bills today, or this year, and we lost 2 states on local options. We lost Tennessee and Florida. And the frustrating part about that is I think it was a mix of, we kind of got caught up in some election integrity stuff. New York City had a really good experience with ranked choice voting, except for the fact that the Board of Elections kind of fumbled it in a very, very public way. And so it's easy for, Governor DeSantis to say, let's not do what New York City did. That sells well. And they also, both of those states had localities adopt ranked choice voting. They had and then they were kind of hung up in some kind of like administrative purgatory about whether they could implement it. But Memphis and Sarasota both had approved ranked choice voting going forward. So I think you have this kind of like storm of like election integrity. Well, locality wanted to do it, and there was some like limbo as to whether they could or not. And then there was a bill introduced. So how are we going to combat that? Because I think it's really, really important. And here's where I actually think what we're doing in Virginia, all of us and more are doing in Virginia, is so important. Right now, if you were to ask me to list the top 10 Republican allies for ranked choice voting, most of them would come from Utah. Utah's been at the forefront of this. They're doing a lot of local municipal expansion. They've got great allies there. They've got great legislative leader, champion people. It's really well done out in Utah. However, that's it, right? There's a couple of Republican congressmen here and there, but it's not a lot of folks. Virginia is the other opportunity. And now you have a governor of Virginia who really sees the benefits of ranked choice voting, and a lieutenant governor and an attorney general. You see the congressional districts are starting to use it for their nomination processes in Virginia. So the Virginia Republicans are kind of leading the way accidentally, but so lifting up those stories and making it not just be a Utah thing, but a Utah and Virginia thing. And maybe, knock on wood, Georgia is going to adopt a local options bill. There's some options going in other places, and hopefully that'll give us a chance to lift up Republican voices in this, because this isn't a Republican or Democratic reform. It's just a voter reform, right? So there's also one in California, by the way. There is an anti-RCV bill for local options in California. We think it's going to die, but we're working really hard with the coalition to stop it. And that's an interesting thing to see. What's common between all of them is they have these kind of shared Heritage Foundation talking points on the issue, which isn't a big surprise. Let me talk about what's going forward this year that you'll see for sure. Alaska, Nevada, and Missouri are worth looking at really closely this year. Alaska is actually going to be voting this summer, which is kind of cool. They're going to use a system called Top 4, which is a combination of two reforms. It's an open primary where 4 candidates advance, not just 2 or not just 1, right? 4 candidates, so it's a jungle primary, they're all in together. Top 4 vote getters advance, single vote, no ranked choice voting. And then in the general election, you have your 4 choices on the ballot, and you get to rank them 1, 2, 3. And so that'll be Alaska's first, will go first in this. They're gonna, because Congressman Young died after serving 50 years, my goodness, in Congress. They're going to have a special election that's going to take place in August. That'll be the ultimate election. And then they're simultaneously going to have a primary and then another election for it in November. So Alaska is going to be really using ranked choice voting a lot this year, also for their governor race and things like that, I think. So there's a lot going on in Alaska. In Missouri and Nevada, they both have similar top 4, top 5 ballot initiatives on the ballot this year. So Missouri's a top 4, Nevada's a top 5, but they're constitutional amendments. I think there's a good chance that they pass. I certainly hope they do. Nevada's has to pass twice through, like, you think Virginia has a hard way to amend the Constitution. Nevada, you have to pass twice through a ballot. So that's a bit of a mess, but Missouri could be a big deal and could be a big impact really quickly, because I think there's a lot of Republicans that are looking at somebody like Josh Hawley thinking he doesn't represent Missouri Republicans very well anymore, but because of the narrow lens of a partisan primary, he is going to be just fine unless they change the system up. So with that, I'll stop talking. There's so many things to say, but I'll cover them in the next bit.
Okay, and Brian, if you don't mind, I may just ask you a couple of quick questions that we got right in the chat right away while
Sure.
we're still on the topic. The first, I'll start from the top. So somebody asked, this is a quick one, are there examples of ranked choice voting in other countries? I know you've given us a lot of kind of the state overview, but are there larger examples in other countries? And then also, I know you talked about some of the outcomes of like what the what it looks like politically, but when you go and talk to Republicans and Democrats, is there different messaging that you use for, different legislators? And so I'd be curious on your take on those.
So I'm putting in the chat a link to some information about Australia's elections. They use ranked choice voting, and I think, Rob Ritchie, who's the founder of Fair Vote and is our CEO, and it's interesting. It's our 30th year this year, which is kind of cool. And Rob talks about this decade being the decade where America changes from voting as picking one to voting equals ranking. And I think that's a really important mindset for people to have. And that's, why local options matter. That's why getting, Elizabeth and others work getting, Arlington and Richmond to adopt it makes a difference, because we start getting used to ranking. And once people do it, they like it. But Australia does it. A lot of places in Europe do it. They have different variations on it. So yeah, most of the other countries in the world that are, republics, democracies, some form of thereof, are using ranked choice voting in some flavor or fashion. And Elizabeth, Heidi, your second question was about talking to Republicans and Democrats. I do think the messaging is different. You say the same thing to both of them, but Republicans, from what I hear, like to hear more about the cost savings. And this is less applicable in Virginia, but in in Utah, it's a big deal because Utah has runoffs, not instant runoffs, just like old-fashioned runoffs like Georgia did. And Georgia Republicans are sick of that. And Georgians, period, are sick of that runoff. Texas has a runoff for their primary. So I think there's a primary for Attorney General that's going to a runoff because in the primary on the 1st or whatever it was this month, they didn't get a majority. So they're going to a runoff. And it's like going to cost the state like another like $6 million or something silly to run a runoff. And you could just instantly do it. You could do an instant runoff. So Republicans like to hear about the cost savings. The other thing out of Virginia you'll hear Republicans talk about is that they nominated the strongest ticket they've ever had in their party's history this past year. And one of the reasons why is because they didn't put their candidates through this meat grinder of a plurality election, whereby Pete Snyder could spend millions of dollars attacking Glenn Youngkin and telling you he's a secret communist. Glenn Youngkin could spend millions of dollars attacking Pete Snyder. You know, they could just go back and forth on that, and they would tear each other down. Whereas ranked choice voting, while you're still allowed to do that, it's just kind of a stupid waste of your money to tear somebody else down when you could spend your money building yourself up or framing yourself as somebody's second choice. So it allowed Glenn Youngkin to come out of the nomination process this past year. He was actually above water in terms of favorables, unfavorables. Whereas when Terry McAuliffe went through a regular old-fashioned kind of primary, he came out and he was not above water. He was even. And those 2 points make a big difference. And for Democrats, by the way, sorry, I'm so focused on getting Republicans to like embrace this. I forget about Democrats. There's a lot to say on the Democratic side, and I'll say that New York perfectly embodies this. Ranked choice voting allows a more representative government. That's just what it functionally does. And you see it happen all over the country where you do it, you see more women and more minorities actually getting elected. So under ranked choice voting for the only the second time in New York's history, they have a black mayor. That's crazy that it's only the second time, but here we are, ranked choice voting. And their city council is now in New York City is now using ranked choice voting this time for the first time, majority female, majority people of color. And that plays out everywhere else, but New York is like a shining example of that. And I think that representation issue is something that Democrats often struggle with. And I think somebody mentioned it in the chat, like for the nomination process last year for Terry McAuliffe, he had 2 really well qualified African-American women running against him. And the ranked choice voting would allow us not to have to pick one. And would have allowed one of them, momentum and stuff. It's hard to run counterfactuals, but it's clear that like if you add Carol Foy and Jen McClellan, that was a sizable amount of the primary electorate that was looking for an African-American woman with their traits and policies to go forward, and it just didn't. That McAuliffe won with a outright majority in that primary, but perhaps things would have been different in polling and money and things like that. Had those women had a chance in a ranked choice voting system, they would have probably fared better.
Interesting. Well, thank you, Brian. Now we'll kind of open it up to general questions. Just as a reminder to anybody, this can be to any of our panelists about any of the issues. Feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand in video. In the meantime, I will ask a couple of questions that we already have. Nancy, I'll throw it back to you. So I know we've been talking about ranked choice voting here for a bit, but going back to campaign finance reform has been notoriously difficult to pass in Virginia. Even the most basic bills seem to die year after year. And so I'm curious, as you said you have a 5-year plan, as you think about the future of campaign finance reform, how do you balance the desire for progress with the reality of kind of a very slow moving legislature when it comes to campaign finance reform?
Thanks, Heidi. That's such a difficult question because, as I said before, campaign finance really isn't a sexy issue. And especially if you're looking, I mentioned the whole issue of saying, if you want to have a functioning campaign finance system, you have to have a good oversight system. And we were struggling with all these people who, like the banning corporate contributions from public utilities, i.e. Dominion, limitations. These are very sexy issues. But when we started just last year, we said we need to do the research and we need to talk to people, experts from all around the country, whether it's the New York Campaign Finance group, the Minnesota Board of Campaign Finance, Washington State, Maryland, and find out best practices. And And we came up with the citizens report that was a very technical report, and we presented it to the subcommittee on campaign finance. And I think, well, the messaging, it was very technical, but it showed, I think we really had an impact in terms of showing them that you really can't implement campaign finance laws like limitations if you don't have a regulatory system that actually can implement current bills. And I think there was a recognition about that. And I think that both Democrats and Republicans agreed on that. And that's why it was a David Bulova oversight bill that passed. I would just like to mention that this is a really important, boring bill that passed. At the last minute, there was an amendment made by, I won't mention the senator, asking that it be delayed until 2024, which is after the next Senate race. So I think they recognize that the writing is on the wall, and perhaps, this goes back to Brian and how long they spent with One Virginia 2021 working on redistricting, because you have to really educate and engage with legislature and then build knowledge and awareness among and get supporters. So we tried to balance it between educating legislators, and I think we did a good job. We got recognition. People know who we are. We were testifying in committee hearings. And then I think through letters to the editor, and I think that actually Brian, through One Virginia, that's where we're hoping to build lessons, because they did such a brilliant job in really building a grassroots level of support. Because at the end of the day, legislators see the writing on the wall, but they want to hear from constituents. And that's where I think One Virginia did a really, really good job. So that's where we're trying to do, is just trying to recognize it's sort of a pyramid approach that, it's going to take 5 to 10 years to actually get this legislation through. But it has to be accompanied with working with legislators, finding champions, and then building up popular support for the issue, which I think when we did the polling with the Watson Center of Christopher Newport, and that was inspired by One Virginia, because 2 years ago, they had a question on redistricting. And I remember it came out like in December before the General Assembly, and it really made an impact, saying, yeah, people care about this issue. And for campaign finance, I've heard legislators say, I never hear from my constituents. I don't think they care about it. So I do think that investment in polling and getting those messages are out there. So it's a dual approach, working with legislators and building up the expertise through research, and then working with the general public.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nancy. And I guess I will open this up to Elizabeth or Brian. A lot of the theme tonight is kind of dealing with these hard issues that take years of work and years of grassroots outreach. And Elizabeth, I know you had mentioned that, so much of your work is grassroots and educating people and getting people to really, start to rally around these things. I guess I'm curious what the plan is for ranked choice voting. Is this an issue, we hope to see movement in a year? Is this a 5-year plan? Is this the next decade? What does the plan look like for ranked choice voting?
Well, I think it's definitely progressive. So I think right now, this year, like our strategy is we want to see at least 3 localities adopt ranked choice voting before the next General Assembly session, because really hard to ask people to expand this when no locality is using it yet in Virginia. So there's no test cases of it. Like this bill was supposed to be, Sally Hudson's HB 1103 was supposed to be a pilot program, but nobody's using it yet. So what we'd like to see is at least three localities adopt it, and then have multiple bills again introduced, either just ones that expand HB 1103 to allow school boards to be elections to be done by ranked choice voting, and then like Brian said, like some of the bigger ideas that like presidential primaries, because another reason why that's good is because that wouldn't affect the currently elected peoples in the next election. They're looking, up instead of at their own election. And I think I saw a question about what actually happened. Why did it go straight to committee? Was it Republican opposition? I went to the General Assembly the Monday following that bill and spoke to many of the members in Privileges and Elections, including Delegate Leftwich, who voted to lay it on the table. And I spoke to a lot of their legislative aides. And what I find is a lot of the legislative aides, they're really for ranked choice voting, and they're like, we really like the idea. And you know, sometimes they'll divulge a little information. They'll say, you know, I can't speak for the delegate or the senator, but this is my opinion, and here's what I heard in caucus. And I think what was being talked about is, you know, the Republicans are using ranked choice voting in their conventions, and they're holding conventions because they're afraid that Democratic Party members, or maybe even independents, are somehow manipulating results if you hold a primary. So they're holding these conventions, and what they said, or what I heard that they said, was that they would like to have ranked choice voting if primaries were closed. So I personally don't want closed primaries. I'd like to eventually work towards something like what Brian was saying that they're doing in Alaska. So maybe we start looking at open primaries with top 4 or top 5, and then going to ranked choice voting. So that might be like our 10-year goal, where our 1-year goal, or less than 1-year goal, is just to get some localities to implement. And then our 1-year goal would be expanding local option or bringing it to primaries. So that's what we're looking for in Virginia, is, you know, getting local adoption and then expanding where we can use ranked choice voting.
Wonderful. Yeah, that makes sense for an issue like this.
Yeah.
Brian, I know you're here to talk today about ranked choice voting, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of your success with redistricting. Obviously, an issue that took a lot of time. It was a long haul. And so I'm curious, you know, again, a lot of what we're trying to learn here is, how do we push these issues across the finish line? How do we get the momentum to really change people's minds? And so I'm curious, was there a tipping point in the redistricting conversation, or, you know, maybe one big effort that you attribute a lot of that change to, or, you know, was it a slow slog over 10 years? I'd love to kind of get, now looking back, your take on what worked and what didn't.
Yeah, so I think a couple things that have like stood out to me as I've learned about other other organizations around the country that have reform minds, ranked choice voting, otherwise. And I realized what we did in Virginia was really, really special. And I know some of the folks are on the Zoom here tonight, or were key parts of that, and it's important. So let me say, first of all, we worked really, really hard, but we also got really, really lucky, right? The switch, you know, like if you take Donald Trump out of the equation and the Democrats taking back the legislature, I don't know that we get this through. But that being said, everything's in flux now, and politics is, you know, upside down world every other year. So, you know, I think we're, you know, that turmoil that we're all in now is as sickening as it is, in so many ways, and if you're not sick of it, you're gonna get seasick from it. Provides an opportunity for change, and this is exactly what you want. You can look back at the progressive era, you know, 100 some years ago, and see similar kind of opportunities there from their tumult. But I think what we did in Virginia was, there were a couple of things that were really, really big. Is, first of all, we had this really cool event on March 4th where we brought together a lot of our like key grass top leaders and other people who could be. We had a kind of convening, I think there were a couple hundred people there in Richmond on March 4th of 2018. And that was a really special day for us. And it was a great day of kind of like a pep rally with a lot of learnings and a lot of connecting and energy. And I think a lot of that carried through for folks going forward. The other thing we did is we organized or helped facilitate an organization of local action groups, and Fairfax is a perfect example of that. You know, we just had a core of, you know, like 10 to 20, depending on what time, you know, what time of year, people there that were really running the show, and they were out doing a lot of petitioning work. And what we decided to do, like Liz and I and you know, Blake or Aaron or whomever was on staff at One Virginia at the time, our goal was to do everything we could to help support those key leaders. I think Bill's on this call still. If Bill had asked me to run through a brick wall and jump through fire and then crawl through barbed wire, I would have done it for him. And Liz would have been right behind me. So that support from a small little staff level to that, I think, was key, because what we knew is those folks would be the ones that would get it done. And sure enough, like, their organizing in Fairfax is what helped tip Dick Saslaw from a hell no to a Brian, here's how it gets done plan. And that was really, really big. Thanks, Bill. And so I think those are key parts. And the other thing that I'll say that not every locality has all the special people we did around the country, but what I'm trying to work with these organizations like Fair Vote Washington and the folks, Voter Choice New Jersey and all these other places, I'm like, go collect petitions. Here's some like specific things like presence at the polls that we did that was really a big deal, but go do it in a targeted way, right? Don't just get signatures because you want to get signatures and you want to build your list. That's good too, but go out to a farmer's market in a delegates district that you care about, that matters. Go to the chair of the committee and start collecting petitions in his or her district. And that's the kind of thing that really put pressure on us and made One Virginia kind of the 800-pound gorilla in this, because we had over 100,000 people on our email list, and that's just not common. I thought other states had organizations like that. It's not. They don't. Some of the best only have like 10,000, 20,000, maybe 50,000 if they've run a statewide ballot initiative already. They might have that many, but not really. So I think it's growing that list, shoe leather and all that stuff, but also doing it in a targeted way. And what I hope is that when we set goals of we want 1,000 signatures, which then generate emails, we want 1,000 signatures per House of Delegates district that we can possibly get, that set goals for folks like Bill and others that were working their butts off to get those signatures, and we could measure that goal. And I think it's hard to get wins in this, right? Like Nancy, you talked about how many how the batting average. It's real tough, but those are wins you can get and you can take, and you can drive home with volunteers and with staff and have everybody rally around that goal.
Great, thank you, Brian. All right, well, we are coming up here at the end, but Nancy, I'll throw another question your way. Ranked choice voting, redistricting are, I don't want to say simple concepts, that's certainly not the case, but they're, easy to kind of encapsulate. Campaign finance reform means something different to pretty much everyone, and you can go a bunch of different ways. So I'm curious, when you think about your messaging and you think about what you're going to focus on, how do you take an issue like campaign finance reform that like you said, even just in this last legislature meant 24 bills, and turn that into a successful messaging strategy?
It's challenging, but I think that this year we were very lucky in that we worked with a grassroots coalition, and they had this one, as we had 24 bills, and they had this one click thing where it's like, okay, here are 3 bills on disclosure that are going over from the Senate to the House to the subcommittee on campaign finance. Send an email to all the senators and the representatives that you want these bills passed. And I think, they had like almost on climate change, everything, they had over 4,000 letters, emails went out. So I think that was quite influential. And I think that monitoring every single bill, say, for example, there was the John Bell, the disclosure, restricting personal use, which everybody that's just common sense. And so watching it go through the privileges and elections in the Senate, it goes to the Finance Committee, and all of a sudden it's like, well, wait a minute, why did John Edwards vote against this bill? He's a Democrat from Blacksburg. So luckily, what we're trying to do with Bill Millhauser and Jessica is identify a cadre of people, at least, maybe 5 people, 6 people, 10 people, students at Virginia Tech, and saying, hey, you guys, can you send his office an email and ask why he voted no on this bill? And so actually that happened. And then when it went to the floor of the Senate, he voted yes. So I think, we're a grassroots group with no money or anything like that. But I think the priority is just targeting districts where we think that legislators are influential and trying to identify people to take action, whether it's on a disclosure bill or anything else. I mean, you can get really bogged down in when you're describing these bills, especially like an oversight bill. It's like, what is oversight? But if you couch it in saying, we're moving forward to comprehensive campaign finance reform. We just need to get these bills passed, and people step up because the polling say they don't care about understanding oversight, but they understand saying, I want to get big money out of politics. They agree on that. 88% of Virginians say we want disclosure. So just using these simple messages, I think works. And then creating these partnerships with these coalitions like the Grassroots Coalition and other groups, Network Nova, it has been very effective. Of course, we're trying to bring in the right, the Republicans also through business engagement, having discussions with Rotary. So it's all about not getting too into the weeds on the technical issues, but just the thing that people care about, which is let's just get big money out of politics.
Yeah. Well, with that, we are coming up to the very end. So Nancy, I'll just turn it over to you first, and I'd love to get 30 seconds just from you. Any last words, any last thoughts, and then we'll move to Elizabeth and Brian, and then we'll wrap on up.
Yeah, and my message, and we're starting off on this endeavor that One Virginia did 10 years ago, and I was sort of depressed when I talked to Brian at one time. He was talking about ranked choice, redistrict, and he said, "Oh my God, I really support campaign finance, but that's so much harder than redistricting." And it was like, oh my God. But you know what the thing with that, I think the most important thing is that have everybody recognize that their voice matters. That's what, and so we really hope we are going on this journey together, but we really hope that we can get everybody to join our vote. You don't have to know about campaign finance. Just tell your legislator, just go to a post-legislative debriefing that they're doing now and ask them and say, why did 20 out of 24 bills campaign finance bill die? Just ask them. So that's my message. Please raise your voice.
Thanks, Nancy. And Elizabeth?
Yeah, that's a really great point, Nancy, about just raising your voice, because I feel like so few people, we're all so busy just living our life that it's actually so few people that can actually make a difference. So if we can just get, activate 25 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, they can't ignore 1,000 people. They start paying attention at 25 people. So, just 100 can really shift some of these votes. And then if we all worked collectively, all of our organizations together on these issues, we are multiplying our impact. And I think one point, somebody mentioned talking points, and I think unified talking points, because you can have your general unified talking points that really help everybody talk about an issue. And you can also have your tailored talking points, but when all the organizations come together and say, when we're talking about ranked choice voting, here's our top 3 talking points. That's really helpful too, because then the electeds keep hearing the same 3 things over and over and over again until like it's a catchphrase, or like the slogan of the organization. So fairvotevirginia.org, you can contact me through that website and join or donate. And if you join, we'll make sure that you have our Slack for our volunteer organizing and all the help we can get. Talk to your local electeds about ranked choice voting too. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. Brian, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I want to give you all the what I think is really matured a lot in the reform space is the national donor funder infrastructure to support state and local campaigns and legislative efforts. And when I took over One Virginia in 2015, there wasn't much, right? I didn't even know who to go to get advice, help, funds, any of that stuff. And now there's Arnold Ventures, there's Unite America, there's Represent Us, and obviously there's the stalwarts like Common Cause and League of Women Voters, the less funders. But there's a lot of that stuff that the infrastructure has been built up. Of course, Fair Vote, the infrastructure has been built up over the last several years in a way, and we all talk about these campaigns, and we work to like get them up to a level which we think they could be successful, and then help them get funds to get up to that level, and then help them get more funds to put it over the finish line. And I think that's a really good place for us to be, because it just wasn't mature this time last decade, and I think that maturity really helps and will support this movement. And I think the other side is there's a story in one of the political reform books that I've read where it's an old fish passes a young fish, they swim by each other, and the old fish says, "How's the water?" And the young fish says, "What's water?" Right? Because you don't recognize it, because you just think voting. So, but we're in this moment now where people are saying, "Oh shit, we could redistrict better. Oh, we could like not gerrymander," or, "Oh man, there's a way to do voting is better. Oh, what did they do in Alaska again? How is that?" So I think the conversation is shifting, and at the time where the kind of grassroots is activated, and now we have things like Slack and whatever to get people together, then you meet that with the kind of a more mature donor community and national funders and strategy. I think we're headed for a big decade.
Cool. Well, thank you, Brian. I hope so too. And thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to everybody who joined. Really appreciate you taking your time to listen to this on a Wednesday night. And yeah, hopefully we not only have some wonderful successes in the past here in Virginia, and hopefully we have some good things coming in the future. So thank you to everyone. I think several people left their contact in the chat if anybody wants to reach out. And otherwise, everyone have a lovely evening.